welcome back to Hebrew. You have perhaps taken a little bit of time last week to have a midterm break. Welcome back to our flow of the course. We are going to start now with a dramatic shift in our content that will continue until the very last week of the course. So for the rest of the grammar for this term, every once in a while we'll look at something else, but we will almost exclusively focus on verbs, words of action. In many languages around the world and throughout history, verbs have been the most complicated, complex parts of speech, and that is definitely true of Hebrew. There are a lot of different things that verbs can do, and in fact they can work in some different ways in Hebrew than we are used to seeing verbs work in English. So this lesson right here is not going to introduce you to the particularities of Hebrew verbs. It's going to give you the whole structure. So I'm going to try to give you the big ideas about Hebrew verbs. This is not something to think about memorizing, like all the details to. This is something to try to understand the concepts. Make sure that you understand the concepts that are being addressed here, because every lesson from here on out is going to be more understandable, and you're going to be able to remember the details better if you have these pieces of information in place. It's almost like if you want to store things and organize things in your house, you have to have a place to put them. So this is going to be one of those organizational lessons where we build some cabinet space in your brain to be able to stick stuff later on so that it has a home. So this is our introduction to Hebrew verbs. Chapter 12 in the textbook in Kutz-Josberger is for some people will be more harmful than it is helpful. Definitely skim it. It is very similar to chapter 5 in terms of giving you a lot of details that may not be immediately helpful for some people, but it will help to explain a lot of the changes that you'll see later. So if you start to read it and you say this is not helpful, that's okay. Chapter 12 is not going to show up on a test. Instead, it's just trying to give you, especially for inductive learners who have been enjoying the translations, it's trying to give you some deductive kind of big idea concepts. But if it doesn't work for you, that is okay. Just move on. But chapter 11, definitely give it your time and your attention. And chapter 13 this week is going to be where you get the details about our first very specific form of the Hebrew verb. So today, in this video, we're going to talk about Hebrew verbs, and we're going to start with the differences between active, passive, and reflexive verbs, which is true for English, but also works in really exactly the same way in Hebrew, which is nice. We'll talk a little bit about what's called verb stems, and then we'll move on to verb conjugations. Those are different things in Hebrew. And then we'll talk about person, number, and gender in verbs. We've already talked about person, number, and gender in nouns and adjectives, so you have a bit of background there. And then we'll end with performatives and suffirmatives. You can think about these as prefixes and suffixes, the stuff that we fit on to the beginning and ends of verbs to make them say what we would like them to say. So that's our agenda for today. So we'll start with action. There are 3 different ways that actions can be depicted in Hebrew verbs, just like in English verbs. There are 3 different kind of modes of these verbs. This right here, this image right here is of Simone Biles. She's an amazing American former Olympian gymnast. She has set all kinds of records and won the gold medal. An amazing performer. If you've ever seen her, she's an incredible athlete. Here is a time lapse of her doing one of her amazing flips here. She's ending up in the corner of the mat back there. But if I was going to describe what's happening here, I mean, one very bland way of describing what's happening here is the athlete is jumping. That means that the subject, the athlete is the subject of the verb, and the verb is jumping, right? The athlete is jumping. So the athlete is jumping means that the athlete is the one who is doing the action. The subject is the one doing the action. We call this an active verb. We could say this a different way. We could take a different perspective on it. We could instead look at the athlete. This is Simone Biles on TV. That's her boyfriend who's clapping for her while she won the gold medal in the Olympics. And so you can say, you can look at this scene and say the athlete is being applauded. So Simone Biles is doing a bunch of stuff on the screen, but what the act of applauding is the kind of action. If we want to describe that action and foreground that action, the act of applauding, but if we want to look at this action from the perspective really of Simone Biles, we would say the athlete is being applauded. This is called the passive voice. You'll notice that the person who is doing the clapping, Simone Biles' boyfriend here in this image, is not the subject of the action. That's just the way we've decided to structure this sentence. The athlete is being applauded. You'll sometimes hear professors say things like, "Don't write in the passive voice" or whatever. People in the ancient world wrote in the passive voice, not all the time, but they wrote some in the passive voice. So we'll come across this kind of verb, and it's actually used fairly often in some texts. It gives the author some the ability to foreground someone, but also foreground actions that are happening to them, without really spending a lot of time on the person who is doing the action. So in any event, that's just one of the choices you can make when making a verb in Hebrew, also in English. And the third type of verb, in terms of action, is the reflexive verb. The athlete prepares herself, or Simone Biles is here preparing herself. Now notice, reflexive means you're doing it to yourself. So like, I put on my shirt today. That's a reflexive verb. I put on my shoes, or I cooked my own dinner. Or the athlete here, Simone Biles, is preparing herself for action. So she is the subject and object of her own verb. That means that's a reflexive kind of verb. So active, passive, and reflexive. Those are three things that are going to be important for Hebrew, just as they are important in English in terms of classifying verbs. So that's first. The second thing is stems. Hebrew stems. So Hebrew verbs, you can divide them up into the kinds of actions that are being depicted, but you can also divide them up into their stems. Every Hebrew verb belongs to a certain stem. We're going to spend the next several weeks focusing almost exclusively on the call stem. You see it here. Call means light or unencumbered or without additional baggage. What that means really is that call verbs just have the basic meaning of the root. So you know the word melech, meaning king? Well, a verb in the call stem made out of melech would just be he is king or she is queen. So it's a very simple meaning of the verb. So the simplest meaning of the verb is the call. We're going to spend a lot of time focusing on the call and how it's built and how it works over the next few weeks. And the next video will be entirely on this call type of verb. There are other kinds of verbs that are in other stems or patterns. You'll hear those both used to refer to this particular quality of verbs that we're talking about. So stem is what is used in the textbook, but other people, I put patterns up here, other people will use patterns. That's what I tend to use. But all to say, so you'll hear stem and pattern be used interchangeably with this. But there are other types of verbs here. So call is the main type of verb. Almost all verbs in the Bible are call, but these kind of simple, no added meaning to the stem verbs. But there are these other types that are they exist enough that we need to care about them. And one of these types, one of these stems or patterns is called the PL, and another stem or pattern is called the Hiphil. And these add additional qualities of meanings to verbs. In general, the PL, when it's added to the call, when it's added to a verb, when a verb is put into the PL stem, you're going to see a different kind of actual vowel pattern that's going to be added to this the verbs then. And don't worry about the details. We're going to get to those later. But the important part is that the PL adds this special meaning. It can mean a few different things. It can make the verb more intensive. It can intensify the verb, or it can be what's called stative. It can be about somebody fulfilling a role or turning into something. So the verb for being a priest is in the PL. The verb stem, the Hiphil, or the verb pattern, the Hiphil, is a little different. It adds a causative meaning to verbs. So if you want to say God caused it to rain, you would find that verb in the Hiphil stem. It would be the verb for to rain. So if it was in the call stem, it would be just it rains. If it was in the PL stem, it might be it rains real hard, or it might be it was like it became rain. It became rainy. The Hiphil stem would be God caused it to rain. So it's a causative stem in general. Each of these has its own passive and reflexive stem. So that is to say, in the call, you got like it rains or whatever. The nifal would be the passive or reflexive form of that verb. It would be either it rained upon itself, like the world rained upon itself or something, that reflexive meaning, or it could be passive. It was rained on. So if I say, oh, I left my baseball glove outside in the yard and it was rained on, that's the passive voice. My baseball glove is actually the subject of that verb, but it didn't do anything. Something was done to it. So when you have something that is the subject of the verb and something happens to it, that's the passive reflexive voice, and that would be the nifal. So if God caused it to rain as the hifal, then it was caused to be rained upon or something, is the hofal stem, the passive of the hifal. And if he was made into a priest, or he fulfilled the role of priest, is the pl, it was fulfilled, like the role of the priest was fulfilled or something would be the pual. So these passive or reflexive versions of each of these stems appear in Hebrew. And we will focus we're really going to learn the call and the pl and the hifal and the nifal. We're going to spend 5 minutes talking about these other ones, but it's just good to know they exist. We're getting this kind of structure into our heads. Then there's this one other stem that we'll talk about, or pattern that we'll talk about, and that is the hitpael. The hitpael is both an intensive and kind of reflexive a pattern. It is a very interesting one, a strange one even, and we'll get to that at the very, very end of the semester. So in any event, but you can kind of see this makes a little house. People sometimes call this the house of call. Like I said, the ones that we're really going to spend time learning are going to be nifal, PL, hifal, and especially call, where we'll spend most of our time. But you just got to know that these things exist. So when I ask what a certain kind of verb is, the first piece of information that I'm going to look for is the stem or pattern. So when I describe a verb, I start by saying it's a call, or it's a PL, or it's a hifal, or it's a nifal. This is going to be the centerpiece of what's called parsing, when we give all the pieces of information that we know about a verb, which is an important part of learning verbs, to be able to kind of parse them out or understand all the different parts of them. So these stems and patterns are crucial. But good thing for you, the only thing that you need to say for the next couple weeks is call. It's a call, because that's all you're going to know, and that's all we're learning so far. Just to show you in the Bible, call verbs account for almost 70% of verbs in the Bible. You can see that the PL verbs, that kind of intensive or stative kind of verb, it's about 10% of verbs in the Bible, and a little over 10% of those hifal, those causative verbs. And then those other ones I showed you, like hitpael, it's about 2% of verbs in the Bible. You'll still run into these. These exist, and you'll see them when you translate, but you won't see them all the time. If you know your call, your PL, your hifal, and your nifal really well, then you know some like 90% of verbs in all the Bible. That's really good. You're doing pretty well. So the next step. So now we've talked a little about active and passive, and we needed to talk about that to talk about stems. That's the last time I'll classify things by active and passive. From now on, I'll just say call, or I'll say nifal, the passive and reflexive stem of the call. So the first piece of information to really remember is the stem or pattern, call or nifal or PL, etc. The second major piece of information that is really important about verbs, and whenever we talk about verbs, we'll always name this. We'll name the conjugation. The conjugation that you've already been introduced to very briefly in chapter 4, but you've been introduced to the perfect, the idea of finished action, completed action, right, which we generally translate with the past tense in English. You've seen the imperfect, that one that had a yod on the front of it. It signals continuing action or ongoing action that hasn't been wrapped up yet or isn't done, generally translated into English in the present and future tense. You've already seen the vav, consecutive perfect, This is that like storytelling mode, vayik tol, that vaya kind of thing at the beginning of verbs, and it's just the continuing, ongoing storytelling mode of Hebrew narrative. And that generally is translated into the simple past in English. Then we've also just briefly looked at that vav consecutive imperfect. It's kind of a future story, a story about the future. It's made by taking a perfect and putting a vav in front of it and kind of converting it to the future. It's less common than anything else on that list so far. It's the least common of all of these types of verbs, but it does exist, especially when anyone is talking about what's going to happen. So you're going to go here, and you're going to go there, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do that. Stories like that happen in the Bible. Moses is telling the Israelites where they will go, or God is telling Moses where they're going to go, and prophets are telling people what's going to happen someday. Those kinds of things are told in this vav consecutive imperfect future story kind of mode. Okay, so you've already seen those. We're gonna learn those in some more detail coming up. That's what we're gonna spend the next few weeks doing, really. But you will also learn coming up 3 different conjugations that you haven't seen or heard about yet. And that is imperatives, or we can also say modal verbs. The imperatives in particular are verbs like go there, do that, get this done, grab that, commands or orders. And there's other versions of these, like if I say let him go, it's a little bit different than saying release him. So we're going to learn like slightly different versions of imperatives or expressions of will that we'll get to. And then participles are verbs that in English would end in like an ing, so going, doing, being. When I said Simone Biles is jumping, that's a participle. It's a special kind of verb, and they had those exact special kinds of verbs in ancient Hebrew. So we'll get to that as well. And then lastly, infinitives, verbs like to eat, to wear, to throw. These are verbs that aren't made specific or particular in any way. It's kind of the dictionary definition of the dictionary version of the verb. So this is these also exist in Hebrew, and they work in their own interesting ways. So between these, you've got almost all the ways that you would see a verb be conjugated in Hebrew. So remember, we have stem or pattern, like call, and then we have a conjugation, like perfect, call perfect. Or you could say PL imperfect, or hiphil imperative. So this is going to be really important. We're going to keep saying these things like call perfect or call imperfect. Those will be the first 2 things you learn, really. So another aspect of verbs that we need to talk about is gender, number, and person, right? And we also need to talk about the stuff that we add to verbs to make them particular or specific. So I add stuff to a verb to make it make sense that it's a verb describing the actions of a particular person, a particular individual, or if I'm talking to someone, I need to make it make sense like that. So I need to add some things to these verbs to make it reflect the person, number, and gender that I want it to reflect. So remember, in Hebrew, we can have independent or suffixed pronouns, like ani melech, I am a king, that verbless clause, and then underneath malki, the king of me, that e at the end meaning me. We can add stuff to the end to say me. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. And remember, we got these first person pronouns. We have these ones are the independent or standalone ones, like ani and anoki. We can just take those little endings here, e, or anachnu means us or we, and we can just take that little nu at the end and make that a suffix that we add to the ends of words. So remember that, right? But also remember what first person means. First person common singular is I or me, and first person common plural is we or us. The second person is when I talk to someone or to a group of people, and I can say, ata, atem, at, aten for you, masculine singular, y'all, masculine plural, you, feminine singular, y'all, feminine plural. These are the independent pronouns, the ones that occur just as independent words. The parts that I've highlighted there, those show up in the next lesson. So thank goodness that Hebrew actually takes these independent pronouns and basically turns them into the ends of their verbs. Yes. So that is the work that you've done is going to pay off. So third person, like he or she or they, these are pronouns that are used to describe people or refer to people who are not present, who are not here at the moment. I said that down there, the masculine plural says y'alls. That shouldn't say y'alls. That should say their. That's their horse and their horse. Looks like I forgot to change that from something else. But in any event, you can see here that yods are important, and then those maims and noons, right? These will be a little bit different. Their hays are used for a third person. These will be a little bit different with verbs that we see, but just to remember, we have our first person, our second person, and our third person. Those will all be reflected in the verbs. So call perfect third person is one of the ways I would describe or start to describe and parse out a verb. So here you can see we're going to learn the perfect first. The call perfect will be the first thing that we learn, and we'll learn that in the next video. But you can see here that there's these endings that we add. You can call them affirmatives or suffirmatives. There's lots of ways that you can use this. A lot of grammarians will get really upset if you call these suffixes, because the suffixes are the things you can add to the ends of these, but these are like part of the verb. So affirmatives or suffirmatives or performatives, those are things that you add because the verbal pattern tells you to add them. And then you can add suffixes before that, like the v for like the vayic toll, like the vav means and, right? That's a prefix. Or if you add an object suffix at the end, that's a suffix. But if it's part of the verb, grammarians like to say affirmatives, which means anything, beginning or end. And then you can talk about the suffirmatives or the preformatives. Preformatives go before, suffirmatives go after, like a suffix. So if that's all confusing, you can just say the stuff you add on to the end of verbs, because I'm not going to test you on any of that vocabulary about grammar, but I will ask you to recognize these verbs and translate them. So in any event, these are the things that you can see. You can see that the call perfect adds stuff to the end of verbs. That's the way that the call perfect works. We're going to see that the imperfect adds stuff to the front of words. So the different types of verbs, the different conjugations, will add stuff to verbs, and actually also the stems, like the hiffle, will add a h sound to the front of verbs. You don't need to memorize any of that now. I'm just telling you that's what's going to happen. It's kind of giving you the big picture before we jump into the little tiny details. Here's the call perfect of shamar. We'll learn this more next time, but just to say, you can just see the shamar, that verb, which means to like watch over or keep. This is the general pattern of the perfect. Here's the affirmatives, or in this case, all suffirmatives, endings. And then you can see, you can just stick shamar in there and boom. There's a little bit of vowel reduction here and there with shamar, but you can see it's just shamar plus all those endings. So if you can memorize the endings, then you got it. You can figure it out. I will teach you those endings next time. One other thing to notice in chapter 11, which is important, is that they talk a little bit about word order, which we've talked about a couple of times in Hebrew and in this class so far. But notice also that they tell you some pretty interesting stuff. They try to get you to realize where the verbs are in a sentence, and if you can notice where the verbs are, it really helps in terms of being able to translate. So if you can notice also that there's like words that begin a certain clause or something like that, like if you can recognize these eights here, you can see that those are direct objects. So you can know the objects are coming. This is all the objects. This is the circumstance, bereshit. Here's my verb. Here's my subject then. Remember, the subject comes after the verb in Hebrew, bara Elohim. So in the beginning, created God. But remember, in Hebrew, the subject comes after the verb, but in English, we would translate it before. So you got to move this, you got to move that back before. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this is, by the way, a call perfect third masculine singular verb, bara, to create. So they point out a couple of like little clues in the textbook for picking out, like when you have particles like ki, like because, that, therefore, that's going to start a clause. And they talk about the difference between a sentence, a clause, and a phrase, which actually are really helpful things to be able to think about. So a sentence expresses a full idea, has a subject, and it has a predicate. A predicate means like a verb and anything else you need from past a verb to make it make sense. But a clause has a verb in it, but it might not be complete, a complete thought. So because he wanted is a clause, but because he wanted what, right? Or if you said because he went, Because he went is a clause. It has a subject and it has a verb, but it doesn't have all the meaning that you need to make a full sentence because you need to have an object to make that make sense. A phrase would be anything that doesn't have a verb. You don't have to have a verb to be a phrase. So like he went to the store. To the store, we would say is a participle. It would be a phrase, and it would be a prepositional phrase. So to the store. To is a preposition, right? In Hebrew, that's el, to the store. So if you have a prepositional phrase and you have a clause that has a verb in it, then you might have a full sentence. So anyway, that just take a look at that in the textbook. I think that's really pretty helpful stuff. But there's one other thing I want to show. Okay, so here's another example. So that's Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. You've seen that a few times. But here's another one. Az shama hamelech alehem. Az means then, at that time. That's our circumstance. Shama is a verb, which means to hear. And then hamelech, alehem. Hamelech is the king, and alehem means to them. Then the king listened to them, is what this means. Remember, our subject comes after our verb in Hebrew. When we translate to English, we've got to move it before. So here's another thing that they talk about that's really, I think, pretty helpful. Sorry, this is a little bit of a different font. It's fairly ornate, but this is the SBL Hebrew font, which is kind of beautiful. It's good to get used to a little bit different fonts with Hebrew, just because not everyone uses exactly the same font, so it's good to be able to read different handwritings. So in any event, but this you can see this is actually Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. So God created the heavens and the earth, v'ha'aretz, in the land, hayata, that is a call perfect of the verb haya, which means to be, and it was tohu vavohu, a welter and waste or something like that. It's actually a nonsense phrase. It doesn't really mean anything. Tohu does kind of mean like void, and then bohu doesn't make any sense. It's just a nonsense word that rhymes with tohu. It was all topsy-turvy or something. V'choshech, and darkness, al panei tahom, upon the face of tahom, which means the deep, like the abyss, and darkness. And then I'm gonna this is a verbless clause, so I'm just gonna add the verb to be. And darkness was upon the face of the abyss. V'ruach Elohim merachefet al panei hamayim. And ruach, which means the spirit, notice that sneaky patak down there. Ruach, the spirit, Elohim, of God, the spirit of God. That's in construct here. Ruach is in construct to Elohim, two nouns next to each other here. The spirit of God. And it's the spirit, even though there's no ha, because Elohim, I know that it's just like a generic word for God, but they're treating it, in Genesis 1, that's the name for God. So it's being treated as a definite here. And the spirit of God, merachefet, was fluttering al panei, over the face of hamayim, the water. That is the deep, this kind of tahom. Okay, so the point here is that this is a big chunk of text, and it's going to look kind of freaky, and it's going to be worrisome at first, right? One of the things that they try to convince you to do is to take a look at these Masoretic, when you get the Bible, and is take a look at these Masoretic accents. These are those things that they aren't vowels, and they're going to add them in the translation, the translation exercises. By the way, you're going to see some of these Masoretic accents. At first, they look like bizarre, and why do I have these things that aren't vowels that are messing up, and it's hard to read the vowels anyway, right? But trust me, just give me 2 minutes of your time, and you're going to be able to see that the Masoretes are trying to help you. The first thing is that these are actual accents. They fall on the accented syllable. So you know how aretz, like this is like eretz, has that little like lesser than sign over it a lot of the time. That's this to show you that this first syllable is strangely accented in this word. It's not the last syllable. So v'ha'aretz, notice how this is kind of over, like a holum almost over the aleph. That's telling you that this is accented right here. It's just trying to help you, you know. But also, the shape of most of these Masoretic accents is trying to get you to read. So notice how this accent is kind of open up to the next word, and this accent is like opened up to the next word. And notice how this is not opened up to the next word. This is an accent called the Zakef Katon. I'm going to show you 3 accents, the 3 most important accents here. These are the ones they point out to you too. The siluk, the end of the sentence. These 2 dots like this at the end, that means end of a sentence. So that's a great one. It's the end of a verse, really. But that's a great one to know. This one here, it looks like a little wishbone. Also, you can think of it as like a little like kind of upside down caret sometimes. It looks like a upside down V underneath the word. There's one of these per verse. It's not in a couple of verses, but most verses have this, and it's halfway through the verse, not in terms of the number of words, in terms of the sense. It's trying to give you like a pause, a place to pause, and it's telling you that you can stop there and translate, and you're going to get almost a full sentence, maybe a full sentence, or maybe half a sentence, but you're going to get a big important sense or unit of meaning that you'll be able to stop and translate. So whenever you see the athnach, that's a place to divide up. And then usually the Masoretes are kind enough to give us 2 more divisions to divide the verse up into quarters. Again, not in terms of number of words. It doesn't matter, how many words are in the verse exactly. What it matters is where do you stop and make sense of this sentence. So they're going to give you these 2. It looks like a schwa. Here's a schwa, right? It looks kind of like a schwa upside down on top of the word, and looks like it should be a vowel, but it's not, right? These upside down schwas. See that there and see that there. Sometimes they have a little line, almost like a method, like a bridle next to them. That's the zakef, or the zakef katon. This divides the verse into 4. So now you have from the beginning of the verse up to here, stop. And then from here to the athnach, stop. And then from here to this other zakef katon, stop. And then from here to the end. So this is to help you divide things up and make sense of them. So if you start here and read to here, you say, and the earth was welter and waste. Boom. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. Boom. And the Spirit of God, boom, was fluttering over the face of the deep. So do you see how this is a helpful tool that the Masoretes have given you for helping understand these words? And then these other little ones, usually when they're open up to the word in front of them, they want you to kind of read this with the word after them. And of course, this is in construct, panei tahom, so they want you to read it with the word next to it. And then Ruach, you can see they want you to read this. It's in construct to Elohim. They want you to read it with it, so they're going to give you this opened up accent. If the accent was pointing away from the next word, then that means don't read it with it. Like just pause. Like this one, for example, merachefet. This accent is pointing away from the next word. It's like just hang out for a second, right? Merachefet. Just look at that word, and that's okay. That means fluttered. You don't know that yet, but don't worry. But then next you get this phrase, this prepositional phrase, al panei hamayim. And notice that panei is opened up to hamayim because they're in construct to one another, the face of the waters. So anyway, this just to show you those 3 accents, the saluk, end of the verse, the athnach, the halfway point, and the zakef katon, these little quarter-way points. Those are really helpful. And just that general idea that accents tend to point towards the word that they want you to read with and away from words when they want you to pause for a moment and just take a breath for reading. Now, like I said, chapter 12. That's all pretty much of chapter 11. There's a couple other things I didn't talk about in chapter 11, but you can read about them in the chapter. Chapter 12, I call this a reference chapter. It's one that certain people are going to love this. It's going to really help them make sense of chapters 12 through 16. There are certain people who are going to say, what in the world? If you start to read this chapter and you think this is not for me, come back to this chapter after having completed our work on the call. And then there's this little trick that it teaches you, but you don't even know enough to understand the trick yet. But once you figure out this trick they're teaching you for like learning all the other stems, it's going to be awesome and it's going to be great. I'll remind you of that later on. But for now, the main point is learn the call really well, and then you'll be able to predict the changes in other stems with this one cool trick they're showing you in chapter 12 that you don't know enough to understand yet. So skim this one, and we'll come back to it later. Chapter 13, that's one to really read and try to imbibe. Learn that paradigm, and I'll teach it to you in the next video.